Hey, friends. So this week we are in the third week of the series called Moods. And moods, vibes, whatever, they're all emotions, basically. And the thing about emotions is that we all experience them in our lives. And sometimes without us even realizing it, those vibes can end up controlling us in a way that is not healthy. Whether it's keeping you from hanging out with people or getting so messed up that you trip up at a track and field meet, whatever it is, we end up sometimes being controlled by our vibes or by our emotions. And today, I want to talk about one vibe or one emotion that always fights to control us, and that's fear. All of us have experienced fear in some form or another. Sometimes it's kept us from trying new things, or maybe it's hurt our friendships, or it's created a script in our head that convinces us of things about our lives that are not true. And the crazy thing about fear is that our ability to experience it is something that makes us human. Think about it. Our fear comes from the fact that we can gather information and think about the future. As humans, we can wonder, what if this happens or what if that happens? And sometimes that makes us afraid. Where we are today is because of the human race's ability to accumulate knowledge, build that knowledge, and then project it into the future. That's why we've continued to develop, change, and evolve as humans. The same ability that allows us to fear allows us to imagine. It allows us to have hope and allows us to dream, all of which are amazing things. So, our ability to gather information and think about the future has two sides, the fear side and the hope side. And I think we would all agree that the hope side is fantastic. We love imagining and dreaming and inventing. But then we have the fear side, the side that comes up with all the what ifs. And we all know the what ifs can sometimes make us feel a little bit crazy. They make our world shrink until our world is pretty much made up of whatever is making us afraid. Think about the last thing you were afraid of and how much of your day was spent thinking and stressing and rolling around and all that stuff. Maybe a midterm, maybe what it's going to be like to go back to school mid pandemic, or maybe it's a boy or a girl and whether they like you back or not. If you're anything like me, though, when you get one of those things that's really worrying you or causing you anxiety or fear, you spend most of your day thinking about it. You're thinking about it, working through scenarios, planning out what to do or what to say. And that's what happens when the fear vibe takes over. Our world gets really small and our world becomes the fear. But here's some good news. Jesus had a lot to say about fear. The problem is, we tend to read the verses where he talks about fear by themselves. And when we do that, they sound nice, but they don't seem possible or practical. For example, Jesus said, "Fear not." In other words, when it comes to fear, just stop and quit. That's not exactly helpful, right? So today I want to look at a passage where Jesus talks to some of his close friends about fear, but with a little bit more context. I need to adjust my computer here. There we go. So Jesus had his 12 disciples who followed him and learned from him. He was their teacher and they were his disciples. They also happened to be his close friends. And at one point, he tells them this: "I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves." He tells them that. That comes from Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. All right, now think about this. Wolves are predators and sheep are prey. So Jesus is like, you guys are the prey, and I'm going to let you loose with a whole bunch of predators. You know, the ones that you'd usually run away from. And then he gets more literal. He tells them that they will also be arrested and beaten. And to wrap it all up, he tells them not to be afraid. It's totally simple, right? We tend to read that story and stop there. But when you look at it all in context, this is just a part of a bigger story. Jesus took his disciples on a field trip before this conversation, and it was all connected. They were in a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And while they were all there, Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, said that this happened. This comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves were sweeping over the boat. Jesus and his disciples were on a small boat in the middle of the water, and without warning, a storm shows up. Think about all the noise from the waves, the wind, the rain, and the thunder, and they're all in the boat in the middle of it. It's not exactly a leisurely cruise, right? And what's Jesus doing during all this? Jesus is taking a nap. So I don't know about you guys, but last summer I was out on our boat. We were fishing. We love to fish. My family does. And so we have a little fishing boat and we go out on Murray and we fish all the time. And last summer we were out on Murray and we were fishing way over, we live in Chapin, and we were way over on the Lexington side of the lake fishing. And I always keep a watch on the weather radar. I cannot swim. I've tried so many times. I'm not afraid of the water, but I just can't swim. And so I keep watch of the weather radar when we're out on the boat just to kind of, be wise, right? And so I was watching this storm, and the radar said that the storm was going around the lake. And with zero warning, within like 1 minute, this storm, gigantic storm, pops up out of nowhere. And we load everything up and we're like zooming across the lake to try to get there. But there's hail and there's like rain, and it's pelting us in the eyes, and it feels like bee stings all over our face, and waves are coming up over the front of the boat, and water is up to my ankles, and I don't have a life jacket on because we didn't have time to do any of that stuff. And it was terrifying. There's lightning striking on the water right next to us, all the things. It was terrifying. And so, if you've ever been in a situation like that, like I have, like I'm telling you from firsthand experience, it is, whether you can swim or not, terrifying to be on a vessel and the waves, like 3 foot waves, are coming up and they're coming over the boat, and just like the boat's rocking back and forth. And we had a motor on our boat. These guys were rowing, right? And so it's terrifying to be in a scenario like that. And so all of Jesus' disciples are on this boat, and this big storm comes up out of nowhere. And I just imagine it to be like this. I like to put myself in scenarios like this, where these followers of Jesus are experiencing real life things. And I'm like, man, I think that would have been horrifying. We don't even have a motor to get us to the other side of the lake really, really fast, right? And so they're trying to row, but they're rowing against gigantic waves that are coming up over the boat, and the rain that's pelting them in the eyes, feeling like bee stings, and the lightning that's popping everywhere, and the wind, all the things. And they look over at Jesus, and Jesus is taking a nap. What? So they're like, what in the world? Can you imagine this? The disciples were scared out of their minds. They were worried about their lives, and their fearless leader is over here sleeping on the deck of the boat. I'm sure they didn't have like an under part of the boat where you can go in and lay down in a bed, right? So somehow or another, Jesus is just over here on the deck of the boat, sleeping leisurely through all of this stuff that they're experiencing, and they are terrified. So they go over and they wake Jesus up. And they're like, hey, Jesus, no, they're freaking out. Jesus, Jesus, get up. And this comes from Matthew chapter 8. They say, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. The disciples are frustrated, they feel alone, and most of all, they're super scared. And they want their leader to calm them down, but he's sleeping. So Jesus gets up, and how does Jesus respond? This also comes from Matthew chapter 8, verse 26. Jesus says, you have little faith. Why are you so afraid? Y'all, I can only imagine the disciples' response when he says this to them. They were standing there, soaked to the bone from rain. They're wobbling around, like probably getting seasick and all the things. And Jesus wasn't paying attention to any of what was going on in front of them. He says to them, oh, ye of little faith. But it's not that Jesus wasn't aware. It's that Jesus was trying to teach them something. Jesus was teaching them about fear. So he gets up, but he doesn't panic, which also I think he was kind of doing to make a point. Because no matter how scary the circumstance, Jesus stays calm. So then Matthew continues in his gospel. This is also in chapter 8. Matthew says that Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves, and they calmed down. The disciples were amazed, and they responded by saying this, "What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Then they thought about what they had just seen. This is unbelievable. The wind and the waves obey him. So now they're not just amazed, they're kind of afraid. Like, who is this man that can calm down a storm? He has such power, and he used it to take care of them. And he was never for a moment afraid. So in that moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear of the storm. And that's the point of, that's the point of the field trip that Jesus took them on, to show them that their feelings of fear didn't have to control them or boss them around, to show them that there is someone bigger and more capable than whatever it is that they're afraid of. So back to the conversation where Jesus says that he's going to send them out like sheep among wolves. Excuse me. Jesus follows that up by saying this, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill your soul." In other words, if you're going to fear something, you might as well make sure it's the right thing that you're fearing. A storm isn't nearly as big as God. And these dangerous situations I'm sending you out into, like sheep among wolves, don't be afraid, because they aren't as big as God either. It's like he was saying to them, remember that boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. Sure, you had a right to be afraid, but didn't you know that there was someone with you who was more powerful than a storm? Jesus goes on, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Jesus is saying, God is paying attention to you. Don't be afraid. You're worth more than the sparrows. Don't be afraid. God has numbered the hairs on your head. Don't be afraid. He's reminding us, and he says, you are valuable to him. God is close. He knows your circumstances. He's concerned with what happens in your everyday life, your real life. He cares about what you care about. When it comes to dealing with fear, this is a big deal because God knows all about it and is with you in the middle of it. But Jesus is not done here teaching the disciples about fear. They go on another field trip. I think I might have gotten afraid of Jesus's field trips by this point. Just kidding. Jesus has been preaching all day long, and it's starting to get late, and people are getting tired and hungry. And the disciples suggest that they send everyone home to go eat. But Jesus seems to think that they can feed everyone. Totally sounds crazy because no one had enough food or enough money to make that happen. Y'all, this wasn't a small group of people. We're talking thousands. This is the story of the feeding of the 5,000 that you may have heard previously. But when the scripture says about 5,000, we're talking 5,000 men. So there's 5,000 men, 5,000-ish men, plus their wives and their children and the other people who are with them. So we're talking somewhere around 10,000 people here, right? So the disciples are afraid. Again, how are we going to make this happen? They said, how can we possibly feed everyone? Then Jesus goes and finds a little boy who has a lunch. He prays over it. And then Matthew says that Jesus split the boy's lunch between the 12 disciples into baskets and told them to go feed the crowd. And y'all, it worked. everyone got fed. It was a miracle. But before they have time to stay and enjoy it, Jesus tells the disciples to get in another boat. And they're probably thinking, okay, too soon, Jesus, too soon. Remember what happened last time? But they get in the boat anyway, except plot twist, this time Jesus does not get in the boat with them. He tells them that he'll meet them on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So the disciples spend the night rowing their boat. And at some point in the night, the waves get bigger and the wind starts blowing and howling. And they've got to be thinking, great, we're about to be in another storm here again, but this time Jesus is not with us. So they're in the middle of this big, huge storm, waves crashing, lightning popping, rain soaking you to the bone, pelting you in the face, feeling like bee stings, and all the things. And they look out on the water and they can't believe what they see. It's Jesus walking towards them on the water. So Matthew writes in his gospel that the disciples were terrified, obviously. So again, I like to put myself in these scenarios. So you've been on a boat, a couple weeks ago or whatever, and there's this gigantic storm that is absolutely threatening to your life. Jesus, your fearless leader's over here taking a nap on the deck of the boat. He gets up, he calms the storm. Okay, awesome. Whew, thank God we had Jesus. It was a miracle, all the things. Now Jesus puts you on a boat and you're going out into the same thing all over again, but this time Jesus isn't there, which was still kind of mind-boggling that Jesus was even able to have the power to calm a storm, right? But this time he's not with us. And then this time we're on the boat in the middle of this gigantic storm, and holy cow, we see this guy who looks like Jesus and he's walking towards us on the water. Well, this is not normal, you guys. It's not normal to see people walking on water. So as humans, can you imagine, put yourself in the place of these disciples when they're experiencing all these wild things that Jesus is doing, these miraculous things that only Jesus has the power to do. And so they look out on the water and they can't believe what they see because it's Jesus and he's walking on the water. And Matthew records, like I said, that they were terrified. In fact, they thought that they were seeing a ghost. But then Jesus says something that gets their attention because they'd heard it before. He says, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." This is Jesus trying to remind them of all the lessons and all the field trips that they'd had up to this point. They had seen miracles and they had heard the teachings, and yet fear was still in control of them. In fact, fear even controlled them after this field trip. They remained fearful to the very end of Jesus' life. When we fast forward to the night that Jesus was arrested, we see that the disciples abandoned Jesus. Why? Because they were afraid that if they stayed close by, that they would be arrested also. And then when Jesus was crucified, where were they? They left because they were afraid. The next day, after Jesus was buried, where were the disciples? They were hiding in a room because they were afraid. But then Sunday came around, and the women who had followed Jesus went to the tomb and discovered that it was empty. They came back and told the disciples. So the disciples went to the tomb, saw that it was empty, and what did they think? They thought someone had stolen the body. But then Jesus himself appeared before them, and they realized that he's alive. And here's the deal. When the guy that you've been following dies and then suddenly comes back to life, everything he said to you before seems more real, more true, and more believable. Suddenly, all the times he told them not to be afraid, it made sense. If he could conquer death himself, as death itself, then he could handle whatever it was they were afraid of. See, for the disciples who loved and followed Jesus, the resurrection wasn't just a nice surprise, it was everything. It made them bold, it gave them strength, and put everything that Jesus said about fear into perspective. Their world was still crazy, yes, but because of the resurrection, the disciples and anyone who followed Jesus could put their fear in its place. It was like they finally understood the lesson from the boat when all the things around them that seemed so much bigger and scarier than they could handle. Now Jesus' words made sense. Fear not, I am with you. It took on a whole new meaning. We know this is true because after the resurrection, the disciples came out of hiding. They didn't run away from the authorities. They started preaching to them. And these followers of Jesus ended up changing the world. Why? Because they started to live as though they believed what Jesus had told them over the course of their time together. Fear not. They lived afraid of nothing, not even death, because they followed a man who had died and conquered death and come back to life. They followed someone who showed them, who proved to them that he held power over very creation and death. All of a sudden, nothing seemed scary anymore. Not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because God was clearly bigger than their biggest fears. So the thing is, we all know that fear will always be part of our lives and will always be part of our experience. Fear is part of what makes us human. It will always be there to some degree. But y'all, we don't have to live like fear is in charge and is telling us what to do. So there's Peter, who was also one of Jesus's closest friends and one of those disciples. He was there when Jesus was doing the miracles and the boat rides and all the things, and he made promises to Jesus that he didn't keep. He told Jesus he would never deny knowing him. Then he denied Jesus 3 times. He said that he'd stay focused on what Jesus told him was going to happen. But then he totally panicked when Jesus was arrested and threw everything else that Jesus had said out the window. He said he'd always be there for Jesus, but then he hid in fear after Jesus died. Yeah, that guy. But after the resurrection, everything changed. Fear no longer controlled Peter. So he gave some tips about fear in the letter that he wrote to the Christians he was writing this letter to Christians. This is from 1 Peter. So he gave some tips about fear in a letter that he wrote to Christians who never had the chance to meet Jesus. Peter says this: cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Do you hear that first word? Peter says cast. And when Peter says cast, he literally means hurl or throw or heave. Y'all, these are active and intentional words. It means that this action doesn't happen by accident, but that you have to be active with your fear. When you feel anxiety or fear or worry, you take it and you throw it to Jesus. Why? This is the most important part. Peter experienced this firsthand in the 3 years that he spent with Jesus. We throw our fears on him because he cares for us. Remember it this way: because of Jesus and all that Jesus did, and Jesus' ability to conquer death and to have control over creation, fear doesn't have to be the boss of you. So here's what I want you to do. When fear becomes the vibe or the emotion that takes over your life and starts to control how you act, I want you to do this. 1, name whatever it is you're afraid of. Put words around it. Not just make it a feeling, make it words so that it's understandable and describable. And 2, write it down. If you like to write on paper, pull out your journal. If you're more of a notes person on your phone like I am, type it out, make a note. But write something along the lines of, I am afraid of blank, or I'm anxious of blank, or whatever it is. And I'm afraid that if that happens, then blank will happen. And put words in front of you about what has caused you to be so afraid. Then 3, throw that fear to Jesus and write it down. You can say something along the lines of, Jesus, I'm giving you my fear of blank. I'm afraid of all of that stuff I wrote before, but those are what if situations. And here is what is true, Jesus, you care for me. And even though it doesn't always feel like it, I'm choosing to believe that you are bigger than any fear that I face. Since you defeated death, Jesus, you can handle my fear. I give it to you. Please replace my fear with confidence in you, Jesus. I trust you. And then 4, talk to somebody. Whether it's me or one of your other youth leaders, or if you're not a youth, then maybe a friend or pastor or anything like that. But talk. Jesus gave us the church as a community to experience and walk through life in our faith journeys together. And it's important to do that. You've got people who want to pray alongside you for your confidence in Jesus to be larger than whatever it is that you're afraid of. When you invite them into your fear, you're inviting in another person who can remind you whenever you get afraid of the truth that God is bigger than anything you're afraid of. So today, as I wrap up, I hope you'll remember that these vibes or feelings or emotions that we have don't have to control us, especially fear. They are never meant to make us who we are. They are, however, invitations to pay attention. So while we can learn from our emotions, we need to know and remember that because of Jesus, they don't have to be the boss of us. I hope you're well. I miss you. I look forward to seeing y'all soon. Bye.